It's Sciandra's Saturday Night Special. Tonight's guest, Dave Szprygada.
Hi there, and welcome to my Saturday Night Special. Tonight I'll be chatting with murderous Dave Szprygada, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt who's also an instructor at the Lake Effects Martial Arts Gym in Western New York. We discuss the allure of fighting, the nature of spirituality, and the history of modern art. I hope you enjoyed the talk. If you do, please like, comment, or share this video. If you want to keep up with the channel, you can subscribe and hit the bell icon for notifications of new content. Thanks! So Dave, murderous Dave Szprygada, I'm so glad that you could be with me tonight. For people who don't know you, you are a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and you are an instructor and co-owner of the Lake Effect Martial Arts Gym in Depew. Is that right?
Somewhat. I'm definitely an instructor. I've been with Lake Effect since the start, but I'm kind of like a minority partner in it, but very minor.
Got you. But you are a black belt. You earned your black belt last year in BJJ, and you fight under the banner for Lake Effect Martial Arts in tournaments, correct?
That's correct. We are an affiliate of Checkmat, which is our worldwide organization. Lake Effect is the Buffalo sect of Checkmat, which formed basically Brazil, and it's headquartered in Southern California.
Oh, neat. Now, did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu make its way through Southland, LA, and then was there a diaspora to places like Western New York and the region?
Yeah, it took a long time to fully get as developed as it is. Like right now, I'm probably one of there's probably under 20 black belts in the region in Buffalo. But when I started, there was zero. The only black belts I knew of, there was a few in Canada. One friend I used to train with a lot, Jeff Jocelyn, was up in Hamilton, and I know there were some other people bouncing around. And the first person I made rank with, which would be going to blue belt, is the first belt that comes after white belt, was a gentleman named Kyle Saunders, who taught out of Rochester, and a ton of the black belts that are in the area now are all branched off of the Kyle Saunders tree. Mm-hmm. Most of the ones that came out of Lake Effect or WNY MMA, which were two of the first schools. But yeah, I would say the route seemed to be most of the Brazilians resettled in the Southern California area in probably the late 80s, early 90s. And then eventually it started branching off to major cities like Chicago, New York City, and then, Philadelphia, places like that. And it gradually made its way to Buffalo. But when I was training, I believe the first black belt in the area was a guy named Chuck Anzalone. He teaches in West Seneca, but he was only a purple belt at the time. So it just goes to show how far it's come in the 13 or so years.
Is BJJ, is that a subsect like Jiu-Jitsu? Correct me if I'm wrong, that's Japanese martial art discipline originally?
Yeah, the original one, it's often spelled differently, but the original martial art of jiu-jitsu came from Japan. And the guy who brought it, I hope I'm not butchering his name, but Michida Maeda, he traveled from Japan. And eventually the Gracie family, who's pretty legendary now, he was offered by the patriarch of the family to teach all his sons the martial art until they became very proficient at it. What sort of gave it the Brazilian name and the Brazilian style, I think, was it always had a lot of ground base, but the excellent proficiency in just using leverage and like intelligence to manipulate the situation in arms, that came from some of the Gracies, because they weren't the typical athletes you would see at a gym, not like a football player, muscle guy. They were just kind of skinny and frail, kind of like my structure, where I'm lanky and thin. So I don't inspire fear in most people walking down the street. Like I play linebacker.
Sure. Now, what time period are we talking? Are we talking like originally from the initial jiu-jitsu? Are we talking about post World War II, or when that made landfall here?
Yeah, it would be, I would say, in like the mid 20th century was when the Brazilians were starting to learn the art form, and it always became a thing on its way there. They used to have the no holds barred fights or Vale Tudo fights where, unlike boxing where they went by the Queensberry rules, the fight just kind of had no time limit. It went from, start to finish till there was a winner, basically. until someone tapped out, gave up, was knocked out. And that's how it did start. It was a lot more fighting orientated, whereas today we have a strong sport scene. But originally it was really self-defense related. There was a lot of kicks, punches. It was probably a lot more violent than you would see, in any of the gyms or any of the classes now, because that's pretty much what it was. It was a martial art developed to win a fight.
Yeah.
Where it's a little bit different now. That should still be the primary reason. And like someone would say, anyone that's a proficient competitor would probably defeat someone that only trains for self-defense purposes because they've had so much practice in doing it and getting the feel down. But when it started, that's basically what it was there. Like the early incantations of mixed martial arts and MMA was what jiu-jitsu was. It kind of branched off into that more sporting aspect, I would say, at least here in probably the 90s.
Yeah, it's funny to hear you talk about, what would you call it, the fight readiness versus maybe the pageantry of the martial arts, because one of the allures I am always hearing about Brazilian jiu-jitsu, or just, I suppose, mixed martial arts in general, is their efficacy versus something like Kung Fu or Aikido, and that's not to disparage anybody who has any discipline in those, but that they're pressure tested, that you can use it. And I know that you teach this at Police Academy, and that maybe BJJ is good for just to have in the tool belt as far as individual combat, like if you have to wrestle away, let's say, something from somebody, or just to protect somebody, just to incapacitate them or to get the cuffs on them. How do you feel about that? Do you feel like this is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is maybe one of the more pressure tested or utilitarian martial arts?
Yeah, I would say it's the best basis. I mean, if you have a wrestling base to begin with, that helps you that much more. But with jiu-jitsu, I would prefer that in the field of law enforcement, because like you would say, you would have a smaller girl or a smaller guy, or just someone, like I said, that's not going to match the same athletic attributes with someone they might be having to put under arrest or something along those lines. So how to manipulate the certain aspects, the positions you want to be, and how to get out of the bad positions. When I actually started teaching, it was almost frowned upon to be taught in police academies because they didn't like the notion of someone going to the ground. But I think, like you said, if you look at the statistics, like 90% of fights go to the ground. You don't see two people in the streets or like a bar fight or wherever you might just see like an illicit street fight. And usually a couple guys start punching, grabbing, clutching, and they fall over and one guy gets on top. That's generally what's going to happen in an unsanctioned fight. So it seems appropriate to know where you want to be. And if you do find yourself on the ground, how to get back up. And if you do find yourself on the ground, how to stay on top. And if you do go to the ground, how to wrap up the person and put yourself in a distance where you're safe. They can't strike you, but you might be able to strike them, or at least hold them down until help arrives.
Right. And I think that's, is it the Israeli Defense Force that they have Krav Maga, or is it Kinzi fighting style, which is you're fighting for your life. You don't know what's going to happen. So gouging eyes, kicking somebody in the genitals, tearing out a throat if you have to. All of that stuff is, how do I put it? You can't really test it in the same way you can test BJJ or judo or something, right? There's lethality in Krav Maga that you simply, maybe you can teach it, but you can't see the end result. So it makes more sense to have something like BJJ taught. Now, do you think that that's what originally drew you to martial arts? Was that it was an equalizer of sorts?
Yeah, that's definitely true. Now, I had to think about that question for a minute, like what drew me to martial arts. The honest answer is I was born in the 80s. Have you ever seen the documentary Bigger, Stronger, Faster?
Yeah, that's an excellent one, and I recommend anybody who's listening or watching this, if you're ambivalent about the role of steroids or performance-enhancing drugs, you owe it to yourself to watch it. It doesn't give you any clear answers, but it certainly gives you a ton of information to mull over.
Right. I was a big fan of the documentary, but the first 5 minutes is hilarious, but it really does sum up my childhood, where it's got like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone with 8-chambered machine guns, Hulk Hogan waving his ear and dropping the leg drop, and pumping up muscles. And, originally that's what I thought. I'm like, well, that's what a man is, And I know we both grew up in the city proper of Buffalo. So I'd say that it's usually a little more rough going to Buffalo public high schools. So I think there's just a little bit more of an atmosphere growing up in like those certain neighborhoods, like the South Buffalo, Kaisertown, Lovejoy neighborhoods, where weakness is kind of preyed upon. So you kind of want to show a sense of strength.
Well, certainly that there was less of and I'm not castigating the current generation, but there wasn't an emphasis from adults against bullying the way there is now. I think that there's almost like a moral panic regarding bullying now, but when you and I grew up, it was accepted that you might have to get into a fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And it might have even been more common, but it was also kind of accepted. And I hope I'm not having like false nostalgia here, but when you lost, if you lost a fight, it wasn't the end of the world. You might have went home with a bloody nose, a fat lip, a black eye. Like that was that. Today I hear kids like they can't lose a fight because for whatever reason. So it becomes a more dangerous situation.
Yeah, it gets put on like World Star, or people are Snapchatting these kids getting sucker punched, and then it's precipitated like I'm becoming an alarmist, but it seems like there's so many school shootings that these things get out of control awfully quick.
Right. And so growing up in that environment, like I said, just being kind of shaped by the 80s and 90s and pro wrestling, I've really wanted to be proficient in something like that. I wanted to always be able to hold my own. And I think just personality wise, I wasn't afraid of a lot. So I had a certain sense of courage, but just because of that, that's not always a good thing, especially if you don't have the skill to back it up. You don't want to put yourself in a lot of bad situations. And I used to watch a lot of, like I said, pro wrestling and boxing with my dad. And originally I started my path as a boxer when there opened up a boxing gym on Seneca Street, South Buffalo Boxing Club. And it was only open for a few months. I started there and I eventually went to Lackawanna, and I was hesitant actually to get into jiu-jitsu. And a lot of guys that stand up in boxing are because, they don't like the notion of going to the ground, but also what you find out a lot of times when you start to cross over into maybe something like MMA, you're good on the feet, but as soon as someone takes you down, you can't plant your foot to throw a punch. And I remember that happening in some school fights. Like we used to play hockey down the one street, and we'd get in a fight on a rollerblades or whatnot. And I would always get the best of people when I was on my feet, and then I get taken down and I was small and I couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
And it was frustrating. So I had a friend eventually that started doing it, who actually is the owner of Lake Effect Martial Arts. He said, hey, I started this MMA program. It's one day of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, one day of no-gi Jiu-Jitsu, and one day of kickboxing. But the classes were later. Boxing gyms were only open from like 5 to 6, and I worked until 4:30, so I'd have to go right there, no eating. Where I was training at the time, like the guys would smoke. They were well past their prime in age, so you didn't get the best training. And when I went over to train with Mike over there, I kind of basically stuck with it for the most part ever since. I took like a small break, but I've been training pretty consistently for about 13 years with no breaks except due to like small injuries.
Sure. Now, when you first started boxing, this was immediately out of high school? Was this during the first couple of years of college?
I think like the first year or so of college, I was just using the weight room, same thing, like bigger, stronger, faster. I thought I just needed to get big and get muscular. And I thought, I was just going to lift weights and blow up to 200 pounds. And that just didn't happen. I couldn't get past like 170. As hard as I tried, I would take protein shakes and everything, but I don't know if it's my metabolism or what. But I kind of had to reconcile with the fact that I was never going to be the big, strong, muscular guy. And, a lot of it just has to do with their friends. I had a friend that was also a big boxing fan. We used to get together Saturdays and watch all the pay-per-views. And he had told me about that gym. And I said, you know what, that's probably more my style. I would love to know how to fight. And there's a currency with knowing how to fight. And I'll probably allude to that a little more as we talk. But if you know how to fight, you kind of get yourself out of certain situations, and there's certain things you don't have to worry about as much.
Yeah, I think that when you had talked about getting into dust-ups during roller hockey and you're taken down, and it's like you could hold your own while you're striking, so ostensibly boxing, right? And then you're knocked down, and then usually the fight ends there. not always, but you take your vulnerability and then you turn it into your strength, because just being on your back, or just being in a more compromised position, you have that ability to parry, or you have that ability to change the dynamic of a fight in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in a way you don't get to with other martial arts. I mean, wrestling comes to mind is one of those that you can really quickly change the trajectory of a fight. And back to what you were saying about, 5 minutes ago with street fights, they typically last about like 15 seconds. They're over a couple of haymakers, and it's like, then the boys get involved and drag people away before the cops show up, is usually my experience. At full disclosure, I'm not I'm not the belligerent in these fights, but I've closed the bar enough times that, just you're privy to what goes down at 4 a.m. in Allentown. Do you think that it was because you had some sort of vulnerability in those initial hockey fights that when it came time you kind of got your foot in the door for BJJ, that it seemed like maybe a difference maker, or maybe that you couldn't make the weight that you wanted? You said that you wanted to be at 200 and then you were at 170, that it was an equalizer, BJJ, as opposed to straight boxing, because you can get to 170, but, and forgive my ignorance, I don't know how the weight classes are divvied up, but you can be the best 170 boxer. You're probably gonna catch hell from somebody weighing 250.
Right, and that was the hard part too about doing MMA when I had started, because my only training partners were both over 170 pounds. I would usually stay around 155 pounds. And when I would fight at like 145 pounds, 149 pounds. So I always was giving up a lot of weight in those training sessions. But because I was doing that, I had to learn how to fight off my back, how to fight as the smaller person. So that, I think that did have a big influence on my style. And truth be told, as long as I was living in Buffalo, I kind of had a goal to be a complete martial artist, to be very proficient in everything. I have some pretty nice like kickboxing wins in boxing, mixed martial arts. I've been able to win at all these different combat sports that I've competed in. I didn't really make the decision to go exclusively into jiu-jitsu until I moved to New York City. And that wasn't even the plan necessarily at first. However, one of the all-time greats, if not all-time greatest competitors, had moved there in 2009 to open up a school. And I would go with another black belt from Rochester. His name's Eric Cady. And we would go there to train maybe a week at a time every 6 months. So we were going out there for maybe 3 to 5 days to 7 days every 6 months, just to try to get ahead of the competition that was in the local area. And I think it did work. And when the opportunity came for the job I work now as a police officer, they tell you right off the bat, like, well, all our positions are going to be downstate, in the New York City region. That scares away a lot of people. But for me, that was kind of the opportunity that I wanted. I wasn't married. I hadn't met Brittany, my wife. Yeah, well, I'd met her, but we were only friends at the time. So I didn't really have much holding me back. And when the opportunity came to go down there, I was thinking, where am I going to box? Where am I going to do kickboxing? And, the pricing. And then I said, you know what, if I'm going to be down here, I'm going to use all that time to get very proficient in jiu-jitsu. And then, when the time comes, if I move back to Buffalo, hopefully I have a lot of knowledge to bring back that nobody else has.
Do you think that New York City, in that respect, is a sort of mecca for martial arts in the way that Southern California, like Los Angeles, was initially for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Definitely.
It would, out of those areas, I would say that would probably be. Southern California still has some of the best. That might be a slight edge, but New York City has at least 3 or 4 amazing schools, including our affiliate Checkmat's out there. But there's also that Marcelo Garcia school. There's a Unity school, which has some of the amazing competitors. It's run by a guy, Murilo Santana. There's Renzo Gracie, who is known as the big jiu-jitsu school out there. And he has a lot of these fighters that are very proficient in the no-gi style without the uniform, with the that looks like the kimono.
Mhm.
Guys are really proving themselves, and they've been winning all the biggest tournaments, and they've been the most successful at that. So yeah, everything's like a stone's throw from each other. So going down there, it's definitely a competitive environment, but that's good too if you want to be a competitor, because you're getting better training at the gym than you do in most tournaments. So when you go into those tournaments, you have, the utmost confidence that you've already gone through so much harder than you're going to face there, that it shouldn't be, it's not going to be a walk in the park, but you have what it takes to achieve your goal.
Yeah, and I wonder if these things sort of self-select. Like Southern California are you talking about San Diego specific, where the Marine base there? Like, is that kind of, or is this more Southland Los Angeles?
It honestly runs from San Diego to Los Angeles. In San Diego, there's a school called Atos that's run by Andre Galvao. If you go up to Long Beach, there's Art of Jiu-Jitsu with the Mendez brothers. Los Angeles has Cobrinha School. Checkmat schools out there in the Orange County area. There's tons of MMA schools out there too. That was another thing. New York City, I mean, it may have changed, but there wasn't the same kind of stable of mixed martial arts school that had a ton of UFC fighters like there was for Brazilian jiu-jitsu schools with world champions.
Mm-hmm.
So the training for jiu-jitsu was just that much better than it was for MMA at the time.
Interesting. Do you think that coming up when you did was formative in your decision to pursue a black belt? Like, it's a black belt is, I think you explained to me once, almost like a 10-year commitment, and not a nascent commitment either, or a toe in the water. It's something that you really have to kind of handcuff yourself to. You have to really want it. Do you think that coming of age in the being a fighter in 2000s and mid 2000s, when Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was getting to be a hot commodity in mixed martial arts, do you think that it kind of gave you the steam to get that black belt? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of, how do I relate it? Like, you join a punk rock band if you're living in New York in the late 70s, right? Do you know what I mean?
It's funny, but if I'm completely honest, there was a shift for me. When I first started training, belts didn't matter to me because I was still living, I think, under that neighborhood machismo where I just wanted to be the best fighter.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to win a fight. You could have a purple belt, but if I was a white belt, I'd rather be able to beat you as a white belt than to be the purple belt losing to a white belt. Purple belt, for those that don't know, is the middle step. It's white, blue, purple, brown, black. So I just wanted to win fights. And then the school I was at started branching the program off into colored belts, and white belts had to stay in their own group because white belts was the biggest group. And I said, well, wait a second. The colored belts that I'm just as tough as are learning more advanced technique, and they're defeating me more regularly because I can't learn that because I'm still stuck with the white belts. So I kind of had to swallow my pride and take a more studious approach to jiu-jitsu than just, energy and testosterone and heart. Because I guess as wanting to fight, that's what really drew me into martial arts too, was I didn't really want to do it to learn how to hurt people and beat people up, but I love the notion of not allowing someone to do that to me. Like, I can take a licking and keep coming. Like Rocky Balboa would, they'd beat the crap out of him, but you could never get him to quit. You could never get him to give up, and you could keep going. And that was kind of my style. I was always going to be more conditioned than you. I was always going to have more heart than you. I was always going to come after you. Once I got to that blue belt level and I realized if I wanted to keep beating these guys, I had to learn more. It really helped me and even just grow as a person to learn. Sometimes you have to train in the parts you don't like as much. So I became more studious, and I didn't even really think about getting a black belt until I was a purple belt. Once you get there, that's when I kind of realized that I was going to make it.
I think that's kind of fascinating that you talk about that you didn't want to hurt people, but you also didn't want to extend people the capacity to hurt you. Are you familiar with the runner, Rich Roll? He's like an ultra endurance athlete. He's a runner. I think he does like 100-mile runs.
I don't think I've heard him. I've heard some of the endurance athletes, but
Goggins, they move in like the same circles.
Right. I'm trying to think of the other guy. He's always talking with Joe Rogan, but another ultra crazy long distance run.
Well, Rich Roll was talking about when he was originally in, I think it was high school, he was a swimmer, and he wasn't the best swimmer, but he had a preternatural ability to just hurt himself in ways that, or accept hurt that other swimmers wouldn't do. So he would swim laps. Like if the team had to swim like 10 laps, he would swim like 20 just to condition himself to the point where he was that calloused, because he wasn't the strongest swimmer, he wasn't the fastest, but just through route, I guess for lack of a better term, self-flagellation, he just got to be really good. And, fast forward a few years, like he had, I think he became an attorney, and then he lost it all. Like he became addicted to drugs, and now he hosts a podcast, and then he got into ultra endurance. But the ability to just take pain and leverage it, I think, is something that is fascinating and beautiful spiritually. And not to be too inelegant, but to pivot to, I guess, let's say the spiritual side of things, you're a proud Catholic, and I think that suffering is endemic to the Catholic condition. Do you feel like that there is any crossroads between the ability to suffer and learn in your spiritual life and what you've learned being a martial arts practitioner? Do you feel like one informs the other?
Absolutely. It's interesting because that was, like I said, that was my original goal, was I'm willing to go through more hell than you are. I'm willing to go further into it than you will be, when I was in the prime of my fighting career. But, there's an interesting duality to that too. And that was always a big thought process, 'cause like you said, with spirituality and especially the Catholic side, suffering is always there. It's a way you don't escape, which might be a little more conducive to like the Protestant faith, where you sometimes see some of those people that are into like prosperity.
Oh, prosperity gospel, yeah.
Yeah, and that just something like that never resonated with me. But I think you see that in Catholicism a lot of times, like, you have to suffer to get to the reward that you want. But it's interesting you bring that up, because just recently I'm seeing a whole duality to that situation, especially now with the coronavirus and my students, that I didn't happen to see maybe in the peak of when I was actively competing, and just seeing it now as a coach and especially as a father. It's really changed my perspective on those types of things.
I know that you had mentioned Protestantism, and maybe not at large, but the prosperity gospel versus the Catholic tenets of faith. Do you think that your Catholicism informs your fighting spirit? So for instance, you're in a situation that doesn't seem winnable in the moment, but that you have maybe enough experience enduring pain or discomfort that you can steady your mind, go into your toolkit, and find a way to leverage or to counter what's happening to you?
I think so. I think the best way I can answer that question is to talk about the best things that jiu-jitsu has given me, and I'm going to try and link it all up full circle. So with jiu-jitsu, I think it mirrors a lot of elements that happen with life. In high school, I didn't really apply myself to my full capabilities. I just kind of did enough to get by. I learned the system. I almost grifted off it. I'm like, well, this is how much I have to put into homework. This is how much I have to put into studying. This is how much I had to put into tests. The things that history always interested me, and gym always interested me, and like religion, when that always interested me. But it's just some of the sciences and that I didn't really apply myself. And then once I got into fighting, I really had a goal, because I really wanted to be good at this, and I realized what it took for hard work. And going into schooling, I kind of had a thought process that everybody was lucky, or everybody was privileged, or everybody had something, and I couldn't necessarily achieve that. And then learning what I did with jiu-jitsu to become proficient, and I would say I became one of the most proficient in the city. It took a lot of work and a lot of dedication, but I learned that I could actually do that. It wasn't something exclusively for a certain group of people. Now, to be fair, in New York, I was training with people that had parents that could afford to ask them when they were a teenager, what do you want to do for a living? And they completely funded them with a trust fund to become some of the best athletes. I might not be a world champion in that black belt division like they are, but what I've taken away was I can be a confident, proficient human being. And I realized I can take that in which I learned there and I can put that in other avenues in my life as long as I'm willing to go through that same type of hell and make that same type of sacrifice and work harder than other people. And another thing that's interesting, I'm sure you're interested in aspects like sociology and anthropology. I believe you studied anthropology in school, correct?
Yeah, I graduated with an anthropology degree. Yep.
Well, yeah, so did my wife. But anthropology and sociology, that kind of stuff has always fascinated me and interested in me. And at this point, I think I have a really good grasp on the underground music scene and the hardcore music scene and the local jiu-jitsu scene and fighting scene. And I've also been in law enforcement now for 10 years between where I'm at now and at the probation department before that. And one thing that I find very fascinating is I see reoccurring themes. Human beings, like, we seem to act, like there's a certain maybe attitude or just personality type that I see people doing in jiu-jitsu, that I see in police work, that I see in music and hardcore, where maybe you have the person that talks big, but you can tell they don't have any self-confidence. Maybe the person that's just genuinely a good person that works really hard, doesn't want a lot of credit. There's so many aspects, and to see those patterns reoccur is something I find very interesting. But like I said, if you can become proficient in one thing, I think it gives you the confidence that you can become proficient in other things in your life, and you can start to make yourself I don't want to say worthwhile human being, but someone you might be proud of, someone you'd want to be.
I think what you're talking about is self-actualization or self-realization, which I think is incumbent upon all of us morally to strive towards. And I certainly would hope to be a self-realized human being at some point in my life. It's an ongoing process, but more specifically, I think you're talking about mastery of self, knowing what you're capable of, knowing what maybe your deficiencies are, and not trying to bolster them through self-talk or delusions, like actually working on these things in order to get where they need to be. So when you talk about somebody who talks big and they don't have what it takes to back it up, you recognize that pattern in somebody in martial arts the same way you recognize somebody like that in the hardcore scene, right? Like somebody who talks about all the songs they're writing or all the shows that they're going to play, and somehow it never materializes. Same with all the work they do. When, to your mind, maybe all they have to do is put in the work and they might like the results they see.
There's a saying, and I can't fully attribute it to maybe the correct person, but it's something along the lines of the more I train, the luckier I get.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yes.
Now, talking about what you just mentioned, full disclosure, I am married to your sister. And people should know that. It reminds me very much of her when you talk about this, because your sister is a very intelligent person and very good at her profession, and I think that she's a very genuine and caring person, but she has got no tolerance for excuses. Do you think that that's something that you were brought up with in your family, or is that just something that that's just endemic to your line, or what?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, I do honestly have a ton of respect for my sister. I probably don't tell her as much as she deserves, but there was a person in my police academy when I was going through, and he could pick out almost everyone's positioning in their family order. And, I said, what about me? He said, I think you're an oldest child. And I think that was because I was always trying to help other recruits, like what to do. I was telling them what to do, getting yelled at for that. But he saw me looking out for people. As my sister's second in line, she still had two younger siblings. So I think she had to get used to, still running the ship. And, I wasn't always there. So she would have to assist with the younger children, my younger brother, my younger sister. Growing up in that environment too, like you said, you're in the city of Buffalo, you're taking metro buses to school. You do kind of have to become a strong person, or you potentially perish,
Mm-hmm.
So I think she's very tough. And I think that it does get instilled. And also, if you're one of four, you're kind of fighting for, you're fighting for your spot. Like if you want that last pierogi at Easter brunch, you gotta put your elbows on the table and get it,
Yeah, I'm one of five, so I get it. You all love each other, but there is that healthy competition to stand out among the litter. So, we talk about it, and she's, she's very caring and a very warm person, but she has got vanishingly little patience for excuse making, which I respect tremendously, because I think a lot of people sell themselves short, and I know that I do sometimes in my worst moments, and I have to remind myself that I'm capable of doing extraordinary things, assuming I'm willing to put in the work or endure the pain of, or discomfort is maybe the better word, in order to get there. And there's something, and again, I used to be, I was raised Catholic, I don't practice the faith, but I think that there's something maybe germane to, maybe this isn't only Catholicism, I think it's in Norse mythology too, the ability to suffer. There is some notion of salvation in it. There's some sort of redeeming factor to it. I mean, in Christianity, the hero of the entire story is a murder victim, so it's central to it all. But do you find that maybe people sell themselves short, that they can do more than they think? Just holding on is not overrated?
Yes. And hopefully I'm going to answer your question in the way you're thinking, but you just put a few ideas into my head as far as that goes. And as I mentioned, like in high school, I kind of slacked and I did the bare minimum. And that even happens in college. You talk to a lot of college professors and they talk about how they have to grade everyone on a curve. And I have a bachelor's degree in economics. I was on the dean's list a few times after I started fighting and realized what I had to actually put in to do the work. But before that, I kind of just coasted. And I think we do that so often throughout life. We kind of do the bare minimum and we coast, and we expect a certain reaction out of everyone where we're just very complimentary, and we don't dare stand for things sometimes. And when you mentioned it with the Catholic Church, full disclosure, I was probably very culturally Catholic until I was 25. Mm-hmm. And then I started to take more seriously now. And I think especially New York was a big example, because I was trained at one of the best schools in my life. Like, for a musician, that would be like
Berklee College of Music.
Well, you're in like a band, like, because the head instructor was Marcelo Garcia. That's like, hey, I'm on a pickup hockey team with Wayne Gretzky. Mm-hmm. Hey, I'm in a rock with Ozzy Osbourne, and everyone else around it. Like, there was always camera crews, there was always videos, but there was something lacking in my life, and I felt a very empty void. And I couldn't explain it because, it seemed like I had everything there, everything I want. I'm living in the coolest city with the best food, the best bands coming through town, the best school, I have a good job. And there was something that was like very empty and hollow, and I couldn't understand it. And like I said, talking about these notions, I feel like I see that all the time now, especially going on social media, when you see Twitter, and it seems like everyone's like a little bit more of this, a little bit more political activism on Facebook and calling out a little bit more people, and I'll be satisfied because I've done my good deed for the day. But it never seems to work, because you see them back the day after day after day doing the same things. And even in martial arts now, like I said, jiu-jitsu has given me a lot of good things, but I'm not going to lie and say there's not negative aspects. Mm-hmm. I see people and they have a tough time separating themselves to like the next step in their life. Being able to withstand the suffering has made me a better husband and a better father. But when you do that, when you take on when you have children, when it's you training, you're like, okay, I'm going to get up at 6 and go for a run. And you know how much sleep you're going to get that night because no one's waking you up. And you know what you're going to eat tomorrow because you don't don't have anything that's going to come up between there. When you have children, you don't know if you're going to go through the night. You don't know if they're going to get sick and throw up. You don't know if you're going to have to take them to the hospital. So your life isn't really about you anymore. You're not living your life for you anymore. And I think there's a notion of like marriage that's intended to be a little bit different. And I listened to a podcast about that recently, and they're saying two people, like, why do you want to get married? Well, we're in love with each other. That's not necessarily the strong enough reason for that kind of marriage. It's not a bad thing, but you're living your life. You and the wife, you're not subordinate to each other. You're subordinate to a higher being and a higher calling, like includes like having children, and you kind of make that commitment and vow that you're not going to live life for yourself anymore. And if you think about our generation, we seem to have a tough time letting go. We want to be the best version of ourselves for so long, but I think the further you go with that, it leaves that hole because you're missing something. And I think when you're missing the sacrifice to a higher cause, your conscience knows that. And I don't think it's just a religious notion, because I feel like so many people that aren't religious are still affected by it, whether you want to be or not.
I can certainly appreciate that, and I think I understand what you mean too, because I'm not a religious person, but I see the importance of maybe a holistic view of your life. For instance, being happy is not necessarily the most important thing in life. I would say that being fulfilled, feeling challenged are also important aspects of your life. And when I asked your sister to marry me, I didn't seek counsel with anybody or think, hey, is this the right move or isn't it? It was sort of what's the best way to put it? I don't want to do this without her anymore. I don't want to have a life without this woman. And to me, that was the impetus. Like, it's got to change. We've got to make a commitment. And you're kind of possessed with this idea that it isn't just for you, and having children too. It's certainly, to my mind, what drove the invention of society, of civilization, is basically, aren't we trying to tame the wilderness in order to rear the subsequent generation, right? I mean, civilization only exists the basis of it is to make a more hospitable environment for subsequent generations. We don't deal with wolves or bears, or we wall up our cities to protect from things that are calamitous and dangerous to our children. And I think that, as you say, like, sometimes people maybe don't have enough instruction, or they don't have enough maybe education, and I don't mean this in a condescending way, or they don't have enough wherewithal or the tools to adequately question why it is they're unhappy. Rewinding to when you were fighting in New York, and you had your job and you were training with the best people and the best bands would come through, and on paper you're happy, but something is missing because maybe there's something that's not there that you need it. And again, to reiterate, I think I've said this 3 or 4 times, I'm not a religious person, but I believe that we are spiritual creatures and that we have a sort of animus to us that gives our lives meaning. It's a life force. You see animals in the cage at zoos, and they have an inkling that something's wrong because they're not hunting, they're not hiding, they're not doing their natural behaviors. And if you're just on a hedonic treadmill, then perhaps you get that inkling too, but you don't know how to quantify it or how to adequately articulate it. Am I on base? That's what you got me thinking about, and I don't mean to run roughshod over you.
No, I think that's a fair take. It's a fair assessment. I'm not a clinical psychologist or anything like that, but I do know once again, with going into New York, like, I can just kind of tell my story. I can't tell everyone else's story or the archetype of why. But I do remember when I was out there, I started going to church by myself. They had a place called St. Casimir's. It was in Yonkers, New York, which is a little bit north of the Bronx. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I was feeling very empty, but I would go there and I would see these like young, and it was a Polish church, if you can't tell by the name. It was a very ornate, beautiful, small church. And afterwards, I remember you would get out and you would see the families all like shaking hands with the priest and walking out, going to like a pancake breakfast or something. And it always put me in comfort because it reminded me of my own family, of 6 and like where I had grown up. And I can't explain why I felt that way, but it would give me a sense of warmth and it would kind of help me out. And lo and behold, I came back to Buffalo for a wedding, ran into my wife, who is now my wife, and we just started talking and hit it off. Eventually she moves out there, and I did start taking spirituality a little bit more seriously, and I couldn't really put it into words. It's not necessarily like I'm like, okay, I'm going to insert myself into this formula for living. It was just kind of stumbling into something. But now it seems so profound to me that it's like the direction I'm starting to go in. It almost feels like the Nicolas Cage movie, like National Treasure or something, where I'm uncovering these old things that have been forgotten about for, at least 3 generations. And I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. This is really neat. And I'm like, oh, this is some harsh wisdom, but it's, like I said, I see it in every single subgroup of people I know. And there's seems to be some wisdom there. And I think about today, what we do, even with training, going to CrossFit, going to yoga, we have some forms of asceticism, intermittent fasting. Everybody meditates today. 50 years ago, you were probably just reflecting in silent prayer. We all talk about sending each other positive energy today, before we may have prayed for intercession. A lot of people will go to therapy and that's, completely fine. But
it's not entirely unlike confession. I get what you mean. And I've had this conversation very recently with somebody you might know. I take your point that we're repackaging certain things that are maybe more palatable. And to this, I would ask, do you see a benefit in that? Or do you take exception to it? And what I mean is a benefit insofar as people are getting their medicine, so to speak, or does it irk you in a sense that when it's called meditation, it's palatable, but when it's called prayer, it's, I don't like the taste.
You hit the nail right on the head. It doesn't bother me at all, but there's a notion of, I think if you ever do talk about religion, you almost have to preface it with, well, not that I believe in that, or it's just for this reason. And, do
you mean me specifically or in generalities?
I would say the majority of people today, are probably considered nuns, NONES, where they don't have any formal organized religion. And like I said, that's fine. But I feel like even in a discussion, people are afraid to identify potentially as someone that's like a Christian or a Catholic, and maybe because they feel like they wouldn't be taken seriously, or they'd be considered someone that hasn't learned yet about the Enlightenment, or like wish fulfillment, or the opiate of the masses theory.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, they're all strong considerations. And personally, it's just a person, as a police officer, I do investigations. I'm a skeptical person. So what's weird with me is you would think most people wouldn't test it, but I've listened to Dawkins, I've listened to Christopher Hitchens. I want to hear both sides of the debate, because if I'm going to commit to something, I don't want to waste my time. I mean, it's always written in the paper, the communal aspect, it is a good thing, but to me, it's not worth it to me if there's not something more. So to answer your question before about do I take offense to it, or do I think it's good that they're taking something away? I don't get offended, but I think there is something extra, because in the believer notion, you are believing in something that's impossible, in that maybe a person rose from the dead. You are believing in potential miracles, or something that is supposed to be scientifically disproven. But there's also, I think there's a hope that's with that you don't necessarily get going through the motions with the modern day versions. And I think that's a strong thing. And you're right, though, there's no scientific way you're going to find yourself there. At some point, you kind of have to jump in And that's something that's a little too far for a lot of people. And I understand why, because there's a notion of embarrassment or being painted as something you're not that's like potentially bigoted. But I do think there's strong benefit in, to sum it all up, there's something that it doesn't give you happiness, because a lot of times you're not happy, but it gives you fulfillment. And that's the strongest thing I've taken away in the past, basically since I met my wife. And I think, I'm discovering that. And if I can tell anyone, like share anything with someone, that would be that.
I think you've said a lot of things that many people have been thinking, and if I'm getting this wrong, just let me know. Maybe what you're kind of deducing is a certain level of embarrassment or oikophobia, which is a concept of like that people dislike certain facets of their own culture or that they're embarrassed by them. So for instance, somebody might be a Christian, but they are embarrassed to be considered a Christian in the same way Jerry Falwell is a Christian, or a Ken Ham is a Christian, with these biblical literalists, because while these people might be Christians, they take what I would consider a very different message away from some of the Gospels in terms of having to look at them through a literal lens, or a lens of literal interpretation. They miss some very important points, and I think that might have scared maybe some possibly accepting people away. Do you think so? I mean, I think even the Christian world kind of looks a bit askew at American Christendom because of what they see in pop culture. Do you see that, or do you get that inkling?
Yeah, honestly, the people you mentioned would scare me away. I honestly want nothing to do with that type of belief, because that doesn't give me fulfillment. That's, like I said, to me, that's the social group, and that's something else. But the funny way to describe it, I used to visit my friend in Los Angeles every year, especially when I would go down to jiu-jitsu competitions. And he's been out there maybe close to 15 years, I know over 10. And he would always tell me people would claim to hate Los Angeles, and he would get frustrated and he would say, well, what part? Because he's like, yeah, it's a city, but he's like, it's composed of like almost 10 sub-cities. There's like the Hollywood Hills in Beverly Hills, in Venice Beach, and like Burbank, and all these different areas. So he's like, well, you could hate, the congested city and the 405, but you might love the hills to go hiking, or you might love the beach. And I think Christianity, and especially even Catholicism, there's like the Jesuits, there's the radical traditionalists, there's the baby boomers, there's the fish fry Catholics,
Well, let's even just make a clear demarcation. I think that the Catholic Church as an institution, you can make a very real case that it is in many ways a criminal enterprise. But does that change the tautology of the liturgy? Does that change the tautology of the dogma behind it? Because to my mind, the Trinity has absolutely nothing to do with reshuffling sex offenders, right? So if somebody says, I'm a Catholic nominally, but I won't give them my money because I read the newspaper, like, I don't think that's an exceptional take, right?
No, I think that's a very good take, actually, because, I would have to deal with the same thing too. I've read all those articles, and a disclaimer, one of my best friends is one of the plaintiffs in the case against the Buffalo Diamonds.
I'm sorry to hear that.
It's not that it doesn't hit close to home, like these are people I know and love too. And another fact to be told, where Joe and I were altar boys, one of the priests there, never did anything to me, but he was one of the ones involved in he was one of the ones that were named in a credible allegation. And I have to come to terms with that too, which is, like you said, it's incredibly disturbing. And so you would ask, like I said, why would I stay? A lot of it's just like where my conscience takes me. And I think you're right. Like you said, there's very flawed men, and I'm highly critical about how some of the church is organized and run, but I stay for the dogma, and like the truths that they claim to be like dogma and universal wisdom have been sufficient for me to stay. And I think there's two worldviews right now. And I guess if I can sum it all up into something, it would be this. There's the worldview that we are fallen creatures with original sin, constantly in need of reflection and examination of conscience. And how can I be better today? How can I personally be better for the world? And what can I stop doing and what can I start doing to make the world a better place? Because it's never going to be perfect. And then I'm thinking on the opposite side, which is a lot of the more modern view, is what do we need to tinker and get rid of to get closer to the utopia? Where my side, I don't believe that can be achieved on this earth, on this dimension, on this consciousness, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, this plane of existence, you see it as a failed proposition.
Right. But I can work on myself and I can constantly make those sacrifices to try and make it a better world. And one of the biggest aspects is to do it without expecting the credit for it. So doing good for its own sake. And I believe in the scripture, it says, where only your Father can see, where I think the world we live in now, you can see anytime someone does good, you have to know about it on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok.
Yeah, that's an interesting point of view, and I don't entirely disagree. I call it social media morality or bumper sticker politics. You have to let people know precisely how you feel about something. I think it's also been called slacktivism. Provided you say the right thing, you're able to that is your what do they call it in the Bible? You're praying in public. You're doing so as a show for others, and as a non-believer, maybe in the supernatural aspects, and as somebody with an anthropology background, I do see it as it is still a faith-based system, this social media morality. It has all the aspects of it, or at least the pageantry of it. When you talk about the focus on being a fallen creature that is trying to maybe save your eternal soul, it puts the premium on the individual in a way, doesn't it? Whereas the other is sort of like a top-down examination, or excuse me, not examination, a top-down, for lack of better words, solution to a problem. Do you think that robs people, ironically, of their agency by trying to do good? Or what are your thoughts?
I think so, and I hope I'm understanding you right. When I think about...
Okay, so if we believe in original sin, that I carry original sin, and that I spend my life attempting to do good in a world that is full of other creatures who still have that inherent sin born into them, if I can do my best within my sphere of influence, just maybe I can hope for some salvation, and maybe inspire salvation in my neighbor. Whereas the alternate would be, we're going to tinker with something, and shame shouldn't exist in any respect, and we're all okay, and we're accepting, and God is just when you feel good. There's no greater presence to it. It's sort of like what I would call like a low-calorie God, right? You feel better about consuming, maybe.
Spirituality light.
Yeah. And I say this, and I'm not trying to make fun of anybody who believes one way or the other. I take this stuff seriously, and that's why I'm talking to you about it, because I think it's interesting, and I think that your spiritual and emotional health are important things, but I have actual questions about the wholesale hall passes we might give to somebody and saying you should never experience shame. Or
I think, going back to the two worldview approach, I think we want to simplify things to put them into boxes of good and evil. Someone might be, economically conservative, and they might be put into a box where, they're considered a Nazi for something that absolutely has nothing to do with that type of term.
You mean like a sort of protectionist sort of economic model, and just for political expedience, people just saying Nazi?
Right, someone might be a libertarian. I'm personally not a libertarian, but someone might be a libertarian, and they might, well, you're in line with that, you're a fascist. But
yeah, I get it, yeah.
But where, like you said, I think on a more religious worldview, like I said, you're accountable, no matter where you come from, no matter what your background is, no matter what your intersectional group is, you're accountable. And what was it? Solzhenitsyn said the line between good and evil runs down every human heart. And I think that's a strongly religious worldview where you're always accountable. You're always responsible for your actions and the good you do in the world. You can't just include yourself in the proletariat and say, anything I do is justified because I've been, victimized by life.
Right.
And I think that, that's a strong way I try and live my life.
So do you think even irrespective of a religious worldview, do you think that that's a good moral compass to live by, because you basically have to deal with rubber meets road? Like, so for instance, somebody has been molested as a child. It doesn't give them a passport or to revisit that crime upon subsequent generations, right? Like, do I have you right?
Right. And I mean, actually using that example, the majority of people that do something like molest children have statistically been majority molested themselves, but the majority of people that are molested don't become molested.
Yeah, maybe that's, and I've heard that too. It's kind of fascinating that, to talk in religious terms, that there's maybe something noble about the human spirit, that they can traverse those sorts of things, that's what separates us from the fallen that you had mentioned earlier, that maybe we can rise to the occasion. Now, I think that you wanted to ask me a question about art, is that right?
That actually is correct. And, truth be told, with the quarantine, I've had tons of time to read. So I have been reading some books, and, some of it does have to do with religious nature. And, I might have mentioned before, the past 3 generations or so in America, this has been going on for at least 150 years. In Europe, though, we have been kind of leaving our religious history behind. And someone had pointed out a correlation in art with, if I don't know if you've ever been to Italy or the Vatican, but it's just completely ornate with fine art, and it seems like, and I'm no artist, so you're gonna have to educate me, but
I don't know if I am either. If you've seen some of my drawings,
but it seems like we've moved to a more modern art that I don't want to say anyone can do, but I don't think you need the same level of skill and practice potentially. But I was just wondering what your thoughts on that are. Everything's not a Marvel masterpiece, if you will.
I think that what you're talking about has to do with religious patronage of the arts, but it's complicated. The past is a foreign country, so it's kind of hard to adjudicate what caused what. But I think what you mean is, when you visit a place like the Vatican, that there is a certain level of mastery that's on display, right? And this is typically done with religious reverence. Am I right?
Sure.
And there is a difference between seeing something like that and something like Jackson Pollock, which is abstract expressionism.
Right.
So I think that if somebody showed promise years ago that they would be brought into an art guild and that they would make art, and typically the only things that were justified to capture an art were things that had to do with religion. And I think we're very narrowly talking about Western European art, right? Because I can't rightly speak for anything else. I'm just going to focus on...
Sure. I have been to the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, but yes, I would say Western European art, mostly like what might be on display at the Met or the Vatican.
Yeah, and there's a definite difference between what they consider folk art and fine art. Like, fine art is almost exclusively reserved for that religious stuff up into a certain time. And I think that might have been beginning with Caravaggio, who sort of began to put... He was kind of a funny guy. He would hang out with gamblers and drinkers and prostitutes, and then he would model some of these biblical people after the cadre of folks that he hung out with. So like prostitutes have found their ways into Renaissance paintings. But then I think when you have mercantilism and you have actual individual private sponsors and that sort of thing, you can you could get private portraiture, and then after that, with art schools opening up and the democratization of art and just, what would you call it? The affordability of materials too. There's bound to be some sort of secular schism from fine art. And now we're at a point, I think it's a postmodernist period where now you can paint in any which way you like, or you can do any which sort of style you like, and you need not know the rules before you break them. And that leaves the viewer kind of just always going back to what they enjoy aesthetically. So there might be a lacking of religious significance to art because of that. And I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe, to my mind, it's a good thing because most of the art I consume is probably low caliber. I mean, it's certainly not fine art. You know, I think my favorite bands are like Dire Straits, Van Halen, John Denver, and the Muppets. So, like, that's probably not permissible. Well, maybe John Denver under the Catholic Church. But I don't know. Does that answer your question? I'm sure some art historians are probably grinding their teeth if they're listening to this.
Yeah, it's going to answer it a lot better than I can. That actually does remind me, though, of Pope Francis's visit to the United States a few years ago while watching on TV, and they had like Jim Gaffigan, Mark Wahlberg, and some band performing, and it was just super awkward because I think the performers were all Catholics, but like it just seemed very bizarre and contrived, and it just didn't fit very well.
Weird. Yeah, I'm sure. Okay, well, I'm going to bring this in for a landing. Dave, is there anything that you want to promote? Is there any place that these people can find you online?
Yeah, I mean, if I want to promote something, obviously it would be our gym. Unfortunately, we're in quarantine right now. We're trying to keep our students up to date as best they can. So we have a lot of technique. I've even edited some old competition footage and analyzed it, so you can kind of get like the best perspective of someone that knows what they're doing and going against it. And they've been doing online classes to break a sweat. So, you know, hopefully we'll all get through this. Feel like my a little bit more deeper, reflective, philosophical thinking. Sometimes I write stuff mostly about jiu-jitsu, but just on WordPress. My account's under Murderous Dave because that's been my accounts for like, so that's on WordPress. And so like I said, the same thing, you know, it's tough at this time when we can't be around everyone and coronavirus and we're always on the computers. So, you know, if what helped me, it helps anyone else, you know, like I said, just go to a church for an hour where that's open, where it's closed, and, you know, meditate. Maybe you'll take something out of that. I don't know, like, but it helped me. If I can help anyone else, that's the best thing I can say. I don't know if it'll work for everyone, but that's really all I got. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. It was my distinct pleasure to have you, and congratulations on the upcoming birth of your son, man. I can't wait to meet him.
And that was my conversation with Murderous Dave Szprygada. You can find him on Instagram at DaveX716, on WordPress at murderousdave.wordpress.com, or through Lake Effect Martial Arts Gym at lakeeffectbjj.com. You can find me online at salsciandra.com or on Instagram at salcomics. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, or comment to let me know your thoughts. You can also subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when there's new content. Join me again next Saturday at 9 p.m. for a brand new Saturday night special. Until then, take care of yourself.